A 5-year-old girl looked up at the most feared man in Chicago and asked him one question. Why weren't you here from the very beginning, Dad? No lawyer, no weapon, no rival in the world had ever made Ronan Marchetti go silent like that. This channel tells the stories that live between the headlines. Mob bosses who never learned to love, mothers who carried impossible burdens alone, and children who forgive faster than adults ever could. The greatest thing this story gives you: proof that it is never too late to listen, but the cost of waiting is always higher than we think. Like, comment, share, and subscribe now. Because on this channel, every story is a mirror.
What Camille did in her final seconds in that room changed the future for everyone. Camille pushed herself up from the chair, her legs unsteady. She had to stand tall. She knew if she fell apart now, she would never recover. Ronan was already looking back at his laptop, as if it was all over, as if the 3 years of her life she had given to his house were now just a signature on a piece of paper. He was ready to move on to his next appointment. But Camille did not leave immediately. She paused in the center of the room, her right hand reaching into her apron pocket, her fingers closing around the small plastic object she had kept hidden all day. She pulled it out. The pregnancy test, with its two bold red lines, was still visible in the weak light filtering through the thick curtains. She looked at it one last time. Those two lines looked like parallel paths that could never cross. One was the life she had, and the other was the life she should have been allowed to have. Then, she snapped it in two. The sound of the plastic breaking was sharp and loud in the quiet study. She broke it again into 3 pieces, then let them fall onto the edge of the polished oak desk in front of him. They scattered near a drawer. The sound of the pieces hitting the wood was faint, but for Camille, it was the heaviest sound she had ever heard. Ronan glanced up, his gray eyes fixing on her with a cold sense of curiosity. It was the look a man gives when he notices something out of place in his domain. "What is that?" he asked. His voice was flat, without any emotion, like he was asking his bookkeeper to explain an unknown charge on a report. Camille did not reply. For the first time in 3 years, she did not look down when he spoke to her. She met his gaze directly. In her tear-filled brown eyes, Ronan saw something he had never encountered before. It was not fear or hate. It was a strange kind of pity for the very man who was casting her out. "Thank you for the 3 years, Mr. Marchetti," she said. Her voice trembled, but each word was delivered with a heavy, deliberate clarity. "I hope you are never kept awake at night by a choice you made without knowing the whole truth." Her words hung in the cigar-scented air. Ronan said nothing, not because he ignored her, but because something in her tone left him completely speechless. For a man who always had the right words in any situation, this was a strange and unsettling feeling. Camille turned her back on him and walked toward the door. Her gloved hand wrapped around the cool brass knob, and she pulled the door open. 2 of his bodyguards stood in the hall. They glanced at her for a second, then looked away. In their world, a departing housekeeper was not worth a second thought. The door clicked shut behind her. It was not a slam, nothing dramatic. It was just a quiet sound as the lock settled into place. But that soft click would echo in Ronan Marchetti's mind for years, a sound he could never quite forget. Ronan remained seated for a few moments after she left. He looked at the signed paper, the blue ink still fresh. Then his eyes drifted to the wastebasket near the door. He felt an urge to get up and look inside, but he resisted. Ronan Marchetti was not the type of man to dig through the trash to understand a servant's feelings. Or so he told himself. Instead, he rose and went to the window. From his second-floor view, through the thick, bullet-resistant glass, he watched the front lawn. A heavy Chicago rain was falling in sheets, making the perfect green grass look like a dull, gray reflection. And there, in the middle of it all, was Camille, walking toward the gate. She was not running. She did not hang her head or try to shield herself from the storm. She walked with a steady pace down the stone path, like a person who was used to carrying burdens much heavier than rain. Her small frame became a blur in the downpour as she passed the iron fence. The automatic gate slid open to release her from the Marchetti property. Back into the world she would now have to navigate alone, with a new life quietly growing inside her. Ronan stood there long after she was gone from sight. He was not sure why he watched for so long. He had fired employees before, cut ties with associates, and made much harder decisions without a second thought. But this felt different. There was something about her final words, the pity in her eyes instead of anger, and the unexplained sound of plastic breaking. He went back to his desk, pulled his laptop closer, and dove back into his work. That was how Ronan Marchetti dealt with anything he did not want to process. He worked until the feeling went away. But later that night, as the mansion was wrapped in a deep silence and he lay alone in a bed far too big for one person, Camille's words echoed in his mind. "I hope you are never kept awake at night." He opened his eyes, staring up at the dark ceiling. For the first time, he wondered if he had missed a crucial detail. But the thought was quickly dismissed. Ronan Marchetti never admitted he could be wrong. It would take 6 long years for him to finally realize that on that rainy night, he did not just push a housekeeper out of his gate, he pushed away the one thing he never knew he needed. That evening, the Marchetti mansion was lit as brightly as ever. The private chef served dinner on a long dining table that could seat 12 people. But only a single place was set at the head of the table. It was where Ronan always sat, staring at the empty wall opposite him, as if that void was the only dinner guest he would tolerate. He cut his steak, raised his glass of wine, and chewed with slow mechanical precision, commanded every aspect of the Marchetti empire with absolute authority. His phone buzzed halfway through his steak. He answered without looking at the screen. At this hour, a call meant either profit or problems. His uncle, Tommaso, was on the line about a shipment needing to get through Southport by sunrise. A problem with the crew required his immediate input. Ronan put down his wine, issued precise orders in less than 2 minutes, and hung up. There was no second-guessing, no agonizing over the decision involving huge sums of money and unimaginable risks. He went back to his plate, and his world continued to operate with the cold, flawless precision of a machine. Yet after his meal, on the way to his office, he found himself stopping at the doorway of the room Camille had just left. He lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on the spot on the floor where she had knelt. Her final words echoed in the silence of his thoughts. He took a deep breath, entered his office, and buried himself in his work. To Ronan Marchetti, any emotion without a practical use was a dangerous flaw, and in his line of work, flaws could get you killed. 15 miles away, Camille huddled at a bus stop on Ashland, completely drenched. A relentless rain fell as the Lake Michigan wind tore through a cracked pane in the bus shelter. Her black uniform and white apron were soaked a dirty gray. She had a pair of yellow gloves in the pocket of the flimsy coat she grabbed on her way out. The final bus was 10 minutes behind schedule. For those 10 minutes, she stood under a buzzing streetlight, one hand protectively on her stomach. It was an unconscious gesture, a need to guard the one thing in her life that was entirely hers. The bus arrived, practically empty. She found a seat in the back and leaned her head against the cool window, watching Chicago blur past. The towering, lit-up buildings of downtown faded into the shorter, shadowed structures of the South Side. She passed neon-lit bodegas, shuttered storefronts, and vibrant murals on wet brick. This was her neighborhood, Pilsen, a place that always felt like home. The sound of Spanish and the scent of fresh pastries were more comforting than any luxuries she'd known at the mansion. She exited at 18th Street and walked quickly to her third-floor apartment in a brick building from the 1950s. The steps were slick with dampness, the handrail was wobbly, and the overhead light was failing. Using the key her Aunt Polar hid under a planter, she quietly entered the still apartment. The only sound was the deep, rhythmic breathing of her aunt sleeping in the other room, a 52-year-old woman weakened by a long battle with diabetes. Without switching on a light, Camille went to the little room her aunt provided. It held just a bed, a cheap dresser, and a window that overlooked an alley. Shivering and soaked, she sat on the mattress and took out the agreement she had signed. Her signature was on the paper, the ink slightly smeared from a fallen tear. In that moment, for the first time since leaving, she allowed the fear to wash over her. It was not a fear of being broke or lonely, but a terror for the child she carried. She understood Ronan Marchetti and the world he inhabited. She had spent 3 years cleaning up its messes. In that world, an unauthorized child was not a gift, but a liability. A pawn to be used by his enemies, or even his allies. And what would Ronan do? Would he claim the child, or would he make it disappear like so many other secrets Marchetti family already had? Camille put the folded paper into a drawer and placed a hand on her stomach. There was no outward sign of her pregnancy, but she could feel the tiny heartbeat inside her. That rhythm gave her the strength to make her choice. She would not tell Ronan. Her decision was not born from anger or a desire for payback. It was about protecting her child. She would cut all ties to the Marchetti name. She would do this on her own, in her own world. A world of honest, if small, paychecks, where people were safe and children did not need bodyguards. She got into bed, and in the quiet dark of her room, worlds away from Ronan's mansion, Camille Reyes felt a new resolve. She knew she could overcome her fear. She had to, because her life was no longer just her own anymore. The following weeks were a blur of looking for work. A restaurant on 18th Street rejected her with a simple glance at her belly. The laundromat on Ashland told her they were fully staffed. A grocery store had a position, but when she returned for a follow-up, her 4-month pregnancy was too obvious, and the job was suddenly gone. Each rejection stung, but she pushed forward, knowing she could not quit. Her child depended on her. She finally landed a night shift cleaning offices from 10 at night until 4 in the morning. The weekly cash payments barely covered rent and food. The daily bus fare was an expense she could not manage if she wanted to save anything for the baby. And so, she walked 40 minutes to work and 40 minutes back home every day, with her growing belly making each step harder. Then the Chicago winter came, a cold so deep it felt like it could freeze bone. The wind that blew off Lake Michigan cut right through her coat. One night in January, with the temperature at -15 degrees, her body gave out. While walking home, her vision swam and her legs buckled. 6 months pregnant, she lost her balance and collapsed against a streetlight, the cold of the concrete seeping into her. The streets were empty at 3 in the morning, and her faint cry for help disappeared into the icy air. She was not sure how long she was there, maybe 5 minutes, maybe more. Then she felt a warm hand on her shoulder and heard footsteps. It had to be a dream. But it was Father Miguel Cortez, the priest from her local church in Pilsen, returning from hands, telling old stories about Camille's mother, about how strong she'd been while carrying Camille alone in Puerto Rico before coming to Chicago, as if strength was something that ran in the blood of the women in this family. One afternoon, Camille passed a thrift store on 19th Street and saw a roll of creamy white yarn for 50 cents. She stood outside the door for a few seconds, then went in and bought it. That night, sitting on the bed in her small room, she began to knit a tiny hat. She wasn't good at knitting, the stitches uneven, loose in places, and tight in others. But she kept going slowly, patiently, and as she knit, she talked to her 7-month belly. I promise you won't be short on love. The other things I'll find a way. But love, you'll have more than enough because I've got enough for both of us. That little hat was ugly, misshapen, but Camille made it with the last pennies she could spare, and with the only thing no one could take from her, hope. The first contraction hit at 2 in the morning on a night in November. When the Chicago wind was howling outside the apartment window in Pilsen, Camille knew it was time. She called an ambulance because there was no one to drive her. And while she waited, She tucked into her bag the misshapen, creamy white knit hat she'd been working on for the past 2 months, because it was the only thing she'd been able to prepare for the baby about to arrive. Aunt Polar woke at the sound of the ambulance siren, her swollen feet carrying her into the hallway, taking Camille's hand and saying she'd follow on the first bus. But Camille knew the last CTA had run hours ago, and the first one wouldn't come for a few more. She nodded, gave her aunt a steadying smile, then climbed into the ambulance alone. Stroger Hospital at 3 in the morning was a world of cold white neon, steady beeping machines, and long hallways. Camille was pushed through on a gurney as pain tore through her in waves. The delivery ward was crowded because this was the largest public hospital in Chicago, and every night women came in to give birth, many of them alone just like her. A nurse named Rosa, a middle-aged Mexican woman with warm hands and a gentle voice, stayed by Camille's side through the whole labor. When the pain crested and Camille needed to hold someone's hand, not her mother's hand because she was gone, not the hand of the man who should have been here because he didn't know, and he never would. She grabbed Rosa's hand, squeezing so hard her knuckles went white, and Rosa squeezed back as if it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Because for her, it was. Because at Stroger Hospital, there were far too many mothers bringing life into the world with no one beside them but a nurse. Amelia was born at 5:47 in the morning. Her first cry cut through the room like a declaration that she had arrived, that she was alive, that she was here in spite of everything. The nurse laid Amelia on Camille's chest, and in that moment, the world stopped turning. Camille looked down at the tiny baby resting against her. Wet black hair plastered to her scalp, skin flushed pink and red, little fists clenched as if she were holding on to something invisible. And then Amelia opened her eyes. Gray-green eyes, not brown like Camille's, not dark like Aunt Polar or anyone else in the Reyes family. Gray-green, clear and deep. Ronan Marchetti's eyes looking up at her from the small face of her daughter. Camille cried, not from sadness, not from fear. She cried because she understood that no matter how far she ran, no matter how completely she erased the name Marchetti from her life, those eyes would remind her every day of the man she'd chosen not to tell. She held Amelia tighter, pressed her lips to her baby's forehead, and whispered in a voice meant only for the two of them to hear. "You're mine, only mine." A few hours later, when Aunt Polar finally made it to the hospital with reddened eyes and ragged breath from having to walk part of the way from the bus stop, an administrative staff member brought the birth certificate form for Camille to fill out. She wrote each line in blue ballpoint, her hands still shaking from exhaustion. The child's name, Amelia Reyes, date of birth, place of birth, mother's name, Camille Reyes. Then she reached the line for father. A blank box. The tip of her pen hovered over the paper, and she stared at that empty line for a long time. Not because she didn't know what to write, but because she knew exactly which name belonged there, and she was choosing to leave it empty. She drew a breath, skipped the line, and signed her name under Mother. A signature carrying the weight of both roles she had just claimed. Then she handed the paper back to the staff member without looking back even once. 6 years can fly by on a calendar. But when every day is a battle, 6 years can feel like an entire lifetime. In the first months after Amelia was born, Camille held her baby in one arm and scrubbed office floors with the other, figuratively, but in truth, it wasn't much different. At night, she still cleaned downtown, leaving Amelia with Aunt Polar in their small apartment in Pilsen. During the day when Amelia napped, Camille went to the Pilsen Community Center to enroll in a free business management course for low-income women. She sat among other immigrant women, many of them not fluent in English, many of them bringing small children into the classroom, and she learned how to keep books, how to calculate taxes, how to register a small business in the state of Illinois. She wasn't the best student, but she was the one who never missed a day. After 3 years of working for other people, when Amelia started preschool and Camille had built up both experience and a small nest egg, from living so frugally she spent almost nothing beyond rent and food, She registered Olympia Services, her own cleaning company. Her first two clients were a dental office and a small accounting firm, both in Pilsen. Both willing to trust her because they'd watched how she worked for the past 3 years. Camille didn't promise anything grand. She only promised she'd clean well and do it right. And she kept that promise. Slowly, one client referred another. Within a year, she hired her first employee, a Guatemalan single mother named Maria she'd met at the community center. Then another. Then another. By the time Amelia was 5, Olympia Services had 8 employees. All single mothers or immigrants like her, women other places, had turned away. But Camille chose to give a chance. She didn't pay the highest wages on the market, but she paid on time. She bought insurance for each woman when she could afford it, and she never looked down on anyone because she knew exactly what that feeling did to a person. Amelia grew up in that apartment, small but clean, walls covered with butterfly, crack of plastic in a silent room. He'd asked, "What is that?" And she hadn't answered. Back then, he hadn't cared enough to ask again. Now, he held the plastic between 2 fingers, and for the first time, he cared. He opened his phone and searched images of pregnancy tests. The screen filled with results. White plastic sticks with small windows showing 1 or 2 pink lines. He looked at the piece in his hand, then back at the screen. The pink line, the same kind of plastic, the same size. His heart started beating harder. Not the kind of beat he felt when facing danger, but the kind that came when the ground under him began to shift, and everything he thought he knew suddenly turned uncertain. She was pregnant that day. The thought slammed into him with a weight he wasn't prepared to catch. He set the plastic on the desk, picked up his phone, and called Yolena. It was nearly 1 in the morning, but Yolena answered on the second ring, because when Ronan Marchetti called at 1 in the morning, it wasn't a call that could wait until daylight. "I need you to find someone," he said. "Camille Reyes. She worked here 6 years ago. Find everything." Camille made collages from old magazines, and a lopsided, cream-colored knitted hat rested on the nightstand by the twin bed, treated like a treasure. Even as her health declined, Aunt Polar welcomed Amelia each afternoon while Camille was at work, teaching her Spanish rice and telling her stories of Puerto Rico. Amelia was fluent in both languages before starting first grade, and she had gray-green eyes that were a mystery in Pilsen. They were eyes that matched no one in the Reyes family. Across town, 6 years for Ronan Marchetti meant 6 years of building an empire. Marchetti Holdings acquired 3 more large real estate projects on the Chicago River, expanding the legitimate business that hid his illegal operations. His name was featured in business magazines, labeling him a successful entrepreneur. But in the criminal world, everyone knew the true power his name held. He married 2 years after Camille was gone, an arranged union with the daughter of an allied family from the East Coast. It was the kind of political move the mafia called securing territory. The marriage survived for 2 years. It ended with divorce papers and a massive settlement after his wife said she could not live with a man who was never off guard, not even in his sleep. A few more relationships followed, but none of them lasted more than a couple of months. Every woman told him the same thing as she left. "You have no idea how to trust." Ronan never disagreed, because he knew it was true. But he also never changed, because in his world, trust was not a strength, it was a liability. His Gold Coast mansion was still illuminated every night. It was still spotless, still flawless down to the smallest detail, but it was growing quieter. Dinner was always served to one plate at the head of the table. The living room never filled with laughter, and sometimes, late into the night, he would sit alone in his office with a glass of whiskey, half gone, the laptop screen bathing his face in a blue glow. The memory of that afternoon would return. Not the whole thing, just a single piece. Camille's eyes as she stood in the doorway and said goodbye. He had spent his life looking into people's eyes, eyes that showed fear, hatred, and desperation. But her eyes were different, something he did not recognize. They were not the eyes of a guilty person. They were the eyes of pure disappointment. The kind of deep letdown you feel for someone you once believed could be a better man. And strangely, that expression haunted Ronan Marchetti more than any rival circling his domain, because he knew how to deal with enemies. But the disappointment in the eyes of a woman he had cast out was a problem he could not solve. The shift did not start with his conscience. It started with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 6 years after Camille disappeared, federal agents intensified their focus on the money laundering trail woven through the Marchetti Holdings real estate empire. 2 federal subpoenas were delivered in 1 week. Prosecutors began calling witnesses. An intermediary bank account in the Cayman Islands was frozen without any notice. Ronan knew that if he hoped to keep his empire intact, he had to know exactly where every single dollar had gone for the last 10 years. Not so he could come clean to the federal agents, but so he could figure out what to bury deeper and what he could afford to lose. He summoned Yelena Vulov, his personal lawyer and his most trusted financial expert, and he demanded a complete internal audit, from the very top to the bottom. Yelena spent 3 weeks sifting through thousands of financial records, and her discovery was not what Ronan anticipated. She found a strange pattern of cash withdrawals that went back for years. Each transaction was small enough to avoid setting off any automatic security flags, but the total added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The trail for all of it led back to one individual, besides Ronan himself, with access to the family's private financial system. Gianni Marchetti. Yelena set the folder on Ronan's desk late one night, met his gaze directly and said, "That $50,000 from 6 years ago was not a one-time thing, it was just the start." Ronan reviewed every single line. The numbers were undeniable. Gianni had been bleeding money from a secondary safe, from business accounts, and from the emergency fund reserved for illegal operations. He used it all to pay gambling debts to a loan shark operation with ties to the Volkov Syndicate, an Eastern European crime family fighting the Marchetti family for control of Chicago's South Side. His brother had not just stolen from his own family. He had been funding the competition. Ronan closed the folder, remained silent for a very long time, then spoke only 2 words to Yelena. "Bring him." Gianni arrived at the Gold Coast mansion at 10 that night, completely oblivious, wearing his usual smile as he entered, just as he always did when visiting his brother. But he was not escorted to the living room. Instead, 2 bodyguards guided him down to the basement. The basement of the Marchetti mansion was not a wine cellar. It had bare concrete walls, harsh white lights, a steel table, and 2 chairs. This was the place the Marchetti family dealt with problems that were never written down. Ronan was already waiting for him. Yelena's report was open on the table. The moment Gianni saw the numbers, his smile vanished. "Brother, I can explain. Sit down." Ronan's voice was quiet, but Gianni sat down right away because he recognized that tone, the one Ronan used just before he did things that could never be taken back. Ronan asked few questions. He just pushed the report across the table and waited. Gianni tried to lie for the first 5 minutes. Then he tried to explain for the next 10, but when Ronan still said nothing, just stared at him with gray eyes as cold as the floor beneath them, Gianni finally broke. The whole story came pouring out. The gambling debts that started when he was 25, the nights spent losing everything at secret poker games, the loan sharks who threatened to break his fingers one by one if the debts were not paid, and the desperation that drove him to his brother's safe. Ronan listened, took a long, slow breath, and then he asked the last question. 6 years ago, did she steal that money? There was silence. Gianni hung his head. "No. You knew all along." "She was only the housekeeper," Gianni mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Who was going to believe her? I never thought you would find out. I figured it would all just blow over." The concrete room grew so still they could hear the faint sound of a pipe dripping in the ceiling. Ronan stared at his brother, the man who shared his own blood. His name. the man who grew up beside him in this very house. And in him, he saw the one thing in the world he despised. His father, the old man Marchetti, had done the same thing. He used the weak as shields for his own failures, punishing those who could not defend themselves to protect the people close to him. Ronan had promised himself he would never be like him. But 6 years earlier, he had become that very man without even knowing it. He had thrown an innocent woman out without any questions, without listening, without giving her a single opportunity to explain the truth, simply because she was the most vulnerable person in the room. And in his world, the weakest person in the room always took the fall. Ronan rose and looked down at Gianni a final time. You have 24 hours to get out of Chicago. As of now, every account, every credit card, and all access to the family is gone. You are no longer a Marchetti. Gianni started to speak, but he saw the look in his brother's eyes and fell silent, because he knew that allowing him to leave that basement alive was the final act of mercy he would ever get. After Gianni was gone, Ronan remained alone in the cold basement. And for the first time in 6 years, the memory of Camille Reyes's face was no longer a hazy blur. It was vivid, sharp, and agonizing, and with it came the knowledge that he owed her a debt that no amount of cash could ever settle. After Gianni departed the basement, Ronan did not go to his bedroom. He went back to his office on the second floor. He needed to be by himself with the newly revealed truth. He had to sit in the same room where, 6 years ago, he had made an innocent woman accept a punishment she never deserved. He sat down in his chair but did not open his laptop or pour a drink. He just sat there in the dark as the streetlights cast long stripes of light over the hardwood floor. Then he began to tidy up. Not because the room was messy, but because he had to occupy his hands before his thoughts consumed him. He opened a desk drawer and sifted through old documents, expired agreements, and business cards he had not used in years. And as he pulled the drawer completely out to move it, a small object dropped from a tiny gap between the bottom of the drawer and the desk's frame, where it had been stuck for years. Ronan retrieved it, a small piece of white plastic, around 1.5 inches in length, its surface slightly yellow with age. He was about to throw it away, but in the light from the window, he noticed a faint pink line stretching across the plastic. His hand stopped. A memory from 6 years ago flashed through his mind. Not perfect, but distinct enough to recall. Camille standing at the door, taking something out of her apron, staring at it, and then breaking it in two. Returning from a visit with a parishioner who was very ill. He found her huddled at the base of a streetlight, obviously pregnant, with purple lips, but he didn't ask her anything. He just helped her stand, put his own thick wool coat on her, and walked her to the church. He had her sit by the heater, brought her a bowl of warm soup, and stayed with her until her face had some color again. You do not have to explain, he told her kindly in Spanish. You just need to know you are not alone. After that night, Father Miguel became the source of strength Camille never knew she would find. He could not offer her much money since the church was also struggling, but he provided her with weekly food from the pantry, a warm place to rest when the Chicago cold was too much, and something nobody else could give her, the conviction that she was making the right choice. Aunt Polar helped in her own way too. Diabetes was weakening her daily. Her legs were too swollen for her to walk very far. But when Camille's nausea was so bad she could not get out of bed, Polar would sit with her, rubbing her back with unsteady everything about her for the last 6 years, her home, her job, her family, and make sure she never finds out. Yolena never asked for reasons. She only needed a deadline. 2 days, Ronan stated before ending the call. Yolena completed the task in a day and a half. The file was on Ronan's desk the next afternoon, flawlessly organized and coldly precise, just like all of her work. The subject was Camille Reyes, 28 years old, living in Pilsen, Chicago. She owned Olympia Services, an industrial cleaning business registered in Illinois with 8 staff members. She had one daughter, Amelia Reyes, age 5, who attended Orozco Academy, a public school in the area. The father's name on the birth certificate was left blank. Ronan read that detail again. A 5-year-old child. That meant she was pregnant 6 years ago. The math connected with brutal certainty. He flipped the page and his breath caught. Yelena had included a picture from Olympia Services' social media. It was from a company family day. Camille was smiling among her employees, and next to her stood a little girl in a floral dress with dark, thick hair, a delicate chin, and striking gray-green eyes that looked directly at the camera with total confidence. Ronan stared at the image as his world came to a standstill. He recognized those eyes because he saw them in his own reflection every morning. That face, that chin, and the fearless way the little girl met the camera's gaze. It was the same way he looked at everyone, without ever looking away. He put the report down, got up, and walked out to his balcony. The city of Chicago stretched out before him, a galaxy of glittering lights. Somewhere in that sprawling city, inside a small apartment in Pilsen, a 5-year-old girl with his eyes was sleeping, completely unaware of who her father was. Ronan gripped the metal railing. For the first time, the hands that signed ruthless orders and never wavered before any foe began to tremble. Ronan was still contemplating his next move when fate intervened on his behalf. 2 weeks after that night on the balcony, Benny Tran, the property manager for Marquetti Holdings' 18-story office building in River North, presented a new cleaning proposal to the administration. The contract went to Olympia Services. Their bid was the most affordable of four. They had excellent client reviews, and their legal history was spotless. Benny had no idea about the connection between the company's owner and his own boss. For him, it was a simple business choice to get the best service for the lowest price. The contract was finalized, and Camille Reyes's name entered the Marquetti Holdings system long before Ronan saw it. Camille learned about it first. On her initial visit to the River North Tower to plan for her team, she stepped into the main lobby and saw the name on a polished brass plaque, Marquetti Holdings. She froze. For 6 years, she had carefully constructed a life away from that name. Now it was right there, etched in metal, gleaming and unavoidable. Her immediate thought was to tear up the contract, drive back to Pilsen, and tell Benny Tran she was backing out. She would find another job, any job that had no connection to the Marquetti name. But then she pictured her 8 employees who were counting on her for work. This was the largest contract she had ever secured. It was big enough to hire 5 more people and finally provide health insurance for her whole team. That was a promise she had made from the start, but never had the funds to fulfill. She stood there in the lobby, her eyes fixed on the nameplate. She took a deep breath. She was no longer the 22-year-old girl who trembled in yellow cleaning gloves. She was a business owner with a valid contract. She vowed never to let fear dictate her choices again. She decided to keep the contract. For the first 2 weeks, things operated smoothly. Camille's team worked in the evenings, so the probability of encountering Ronan was almost zero. Camille visited once a week in the afternoon to inspect their work and sign paperwork with Benny, leaving before anyone on the executive floor knew she was there. She hoped she could maintain that distance. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon during the 3rd week, the fire sprinkler on the 9th floor went off by mistake, setting off the building-wide alarm. Red lights flashed while speakers ordered an immediate evacuation. Over 300 people rushed into the stairwells as the elevators locked down for safety. Camille was on the 12th floor inspecting a newly cleaned office. Ronan was on the 15th floor in a meeting with Yelena. They both entered the emergency stairs along with everyone else. Between the 10th and 9th floors, the crowd stalled for a moment when a door got jammed. Camille glanced up, and at that same moment, Ronan was looking down. An entire 6 years seemed to flash by in a heartbeat. She knew it was him instantly. He was just as tall, with the same cold gray eyes and black suit she remembered. But now, tiny wrinkles had formed around his eyes, and a single streak of silver touched his temple. He recognized her too, but she was not the person he recalled. Camille stood before him in a crisp white blouse and dress pants, her hair tied in a professional bun. and an identification badge on her chest that said Olympia Services. Below the company name was a single word, owner. Her posture was perfect. Her gaze did not falter. She was no longer a housekeeper in a simple black uniform, and they both understood that. Camille, he said, his voice lacking its usual cold authority, sounding almost shocked. Mr. Marchetti, she answered, her tone polite, steady, and intentionally distant. She then turned and continued down the stairs. Once everyone was gathered in the lobby, waiting for the all-clear, Ronan stood by the glass doors. He appeared to be looking at the street, but his attention was fixed on a corner of the lobby. There, a little girl with black hair sat on a bench beside one of Camille's workers. Her feet dangled high above the ground as she sketched in a small notebook. School was out that day, so with no one to watch her, Amelia had come to work with her mother. The little girl looked up, almost as if she felt his stare. Her gray-green eyes met Ronan's gray eyes from across the busy room. Amelia showed no fear, no shyness. She simply observed him, with the innocent wonder of a 5-year-old, before returning to her drawing. But Ronan could not look away. He stood frozen in the lobby of his own building, surrounded by his staff, feeling as if all the air had been stolen from his lungs. That little girl did not just have his eyes. She was a smaller, perfect reflection of him. He knew then that the photograph, the numbers, and the plastic test stick had all told the truth. And that truth was sitting just 10 steps from him, drawing in a notebook, completely oblivious that the man staring at her with clenched fists was her own father. 2 days after their meeting in the stairwell, Camille got a call from Ronan's assistant. She was invited to a meeting on the top floor to discuss the cleaning contract. The reason sounded legitimate, a normal business practice, but Camille knew it was not about cleaning services. She agreed to go because her time for hiding was over. That afternoon, she arrived at the building in a navy blazer with her hair in a low bun. She wore no jewelry, nothing extra. The elevator took her to the top floor. As the doors slid open, she saw a long hallway of gray stone. Glass walls from floor to ceiling showed the entire Chicago skyline, with the river below looking like a silver ribbon between the tall buildings. An assistant showed her into a conference room and shut the door behind her. Ronan was waiting. He was not wearing a suit, just a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Camille noticed that small detail right away because Ronan Marchetti always wore a suit like it was armor. Taking it off meant he was trying to seem less intimidating. That intention alone told her this meeting was about more than just a cleaning contract. For the first 15 minutes, they discussed business. Ronan asked about the quality of her service, how often supervisors checked in, and their procedures. Camille gave him clear, professional answers. She had been running Olympia Services long enough to know how to face powerful men without showing fear, and Ronan could see she was not the same woman he remembered. He then put his pen on the table and was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was completely different. It was no longer the voice of a company president reviewing a contractor. 6 years ago, on the day you walked out of my house, you were pregnant. It was not a question. It was a fact. Camille did not even blink. She did not lose her color. She gave him none of the dramatic response he might have expected. She met his eyes and remained silent, just long enough for him to realize she was thinking about her words, not scrambling for a reply. The truth was not important to you 6 years ago, Mr. Marchetti. Why is it important now? His words hit Ronan like a punch he could not dodge. Not because she was mistaken, but because she was absolutely correct. He had no defense. 6 years ago, he refused to listen. He did not need to listen. He never gave her a single opportunity to say anything. He took a deep breath and did something he had almost never done in his 37 years of life. Not in front of another person. I was wrong. 3 words, shorter than any command he had ever issued, but they carried more weight than all of them combined. Camille showed no reaction. But inside, something changed, because this was the first time she had ever heard this man admit a mistake. She knew that for someone like him, saying those 3 words was more difficult than any underworld negotiation. I know about Gianni, he continued. I know you were not the one who took the money. I know the whole story, but I found out too late. Camille remained silent. She waited, sensing he had more to say. Ronan leaned closer, his voice getting lower. But you need to understand something, Camille. If that little girl has Marchetti blood, it does not matter if you want it or not, or how long you hide her. She is in a danger you cannot imagine. I have more enemies than you realize, and they do not leave family alone. Camille felt her blood run cold. For 6 years, she had been running from the Marchetti name for this very reason. She knew exactly how dangerous that life was. She had cleaned blood from hallway floors and knew violence was not rare in his world. It was how things worked. But she also understood that 6 years in hiding had not changed a thing. Blood ties did not just vanish because she wanted them to. Amelia's gray-green eyes would always be there. If anyone looked carefully, they would see the connection, whether the birth certificate listed a father or not. Amelia is not a game piece, she said. Her voice was firm, but her hands were clenched together under the table. She is not property. She is not a weakness. She is not a target. She is my daughter. Is she my daughter too? The question hung in the air between them, in that glass room high above Chicago, spanning 6 years of silence. Camille looked at him for a long moment. There was no anger in her eyes, no weakness, just the truth she had been carrying by herself for 6 years. And it was now too much to carry on her own. Yes, she said, Amelia is yours. The room fell completely still. The Chicago skyline sparkled behind the glass, as if the world outside had no clue that a single truth spoken in that room had just altered 3 lives forever. Ronan drove back to his Gold Coast mansion without a word. The radio was off. He made no calls. He gave no orders. For the first time in a long while, he drove himself, not wanting a driver to see his expression. He parked inside the garage, walked through the dark hall without flipping on a light, and went directly to his office, closing the door behind him. He sat down in his usual chair, poured whiskey from a bottle of Macallan, and set the glass on his desk without taking a sip. With his right hand, he opened a drawer, pulled out the yellowed plastic piece of the pregnancy test, and laid it next to his phone, which showed the picture of Amelia that Yelena had found. The plastic fragment and the photograph sat side by side on the oak desk. One was proof of a truth he had rejected 6 years earlier, and the other was the result of that truth. A 5-year-old girl who had his eyes and her mother's smile. He looked at the photo and started to count. 5 birthdays he had missed. 5 Christmas mornings when he was not the one putting presents under the tree. He did not see her first step. He did not hear her first word. He was not there at the school gate on her first day. He never stayed up with her when she had a fever. He was not there to catch her when she fell. 5 years, day after day, moment after moment, had all gone by without him even knowing. Now, it all piled up before him like a judgment that no lawyer could reduce. He glanced at the piece of plastic. He recalled the sound it made when it broke in this very office 6 years ago. At the time, he had asked, "What is that?" in a dismissive tone, then looked back at his laptop. If he had just gotten up, picked up the pieces, looked at them, and asked just one more question, everything would have turned out differently. But he did not, because he was Ronan Marchetti, a man who had control over everything, except for the ability to listen when it was most important. He sat there in the darkness, as a streetlight cast a pale stripe across the untouched glass of whiskey. He felt something rising in his chest that was hot, heavy, and strange. He did not recognize it at first, because it was an emotion he had buried since he was a child, since his father taught him that tears were a sign of weakness, and weakness was not allowed in the Marchetti family. But on this night, nobody was there to see. No enemies, no allies, no guards. It was just him and the photo of a 5-year-old daughter who had no idea who her father was. A single tear rolled down his right cheek. He wiped it away instantly with the back of his hand. It was a fast, decisive move, the reflex of a man trained to conceal any sign of weakness. But the tear was real, and he knew it was real. 15 miles from there, in an apartment in Pilsen, Camille sat on the edge of Amelia's bed and watched her sleep. The child was lying on her side, hugging an old teddy bear. Her black hair fanned out on the pillow, and her breathing was soft and steady. The small room was so quiet that Camille could hear the slow turn of the ceiling fan and the sounds of stray cats in the alley. She had built this peaceful life over 6 years, with hard work, with tears, and with nights spent walking 40 minutes in the snow. Amelia had friends, a school, her Aunt Peril, and a stable life. Everything a child could need except for a father. And now that father knew she was alive. Camille was terrified. She was not afraid Ronan would harm Amelia, but that his power would destroy the small, safe world she had created. His lawyers were better than any she could hire. His wealth was more than she could ever make in her life. If he decided he wanted custody, she would not have a chance in a courtroom. But then she looked at Amelia and recalled the question her daughter asked every Father's Day, when her school had the children make cards for their dads. "Mom, who should I give this to?" Every time she heard it, her heart ached. And each time she would say, "Make one for Aunt Peril." Then she would turn away so Amelia could not see the tears in her eyes. Amelia had a right to know her father. Camille knew this was true, even though it went against all of her protective instincts. She leaned down, kissed Amelia's forehead, then went into the living room and sat by herself in the dark. In the same way, Ronan was sitting alone in the dark on the other side of the city. Two people were caught between their past and future, between fear and duty, and between pride and a truth they both knew could not stay hidden anymore. 3 days after that very long night, Ronan called Camille. He was direct and did not waste time, saying he wanted a DNA test. It was not because he did not believe her, but because he needed a legal basis before he could enter Amelia's life in any way. "I do not want to show up with just words," he said. "I want to show up with responsibility, and responsibility requires paperwork." Camille was quiet for a few seconds on the phone. She had no reason to refuse, and she also knew that in the American legal system, a DNA test was the first step to legally establish who the father was, something she was afraid of. But she had no right to keep him from his daughter. "All right," she agreed, "but we do this my way. I choose the lab, not you." Ronan accepted instantly. The test was at a private clinic in Lakeview that Camille found online, a neutral place with no ties to the Marchetti name. They took a sample from Amelia's cheek with a swab, telling her it was a routine health check, and she asked no further questions. The results would take 2 weeks. For both of them, those 2 weeks were the longest of their lives. Camille tried to keep things normal while she waited. She took Amelia to school in the mornings, managed contracts in the afternoons, and read stories to her at night. Life seemed the same on the surface, but just beneath, she knew their world was about to change, and she had no say in where it would go. Ronan spent that time learning about Amelia, not by spying, but by finding the public traces she left behind. The Orasco Academy website had pictures of student events. He saw Amelia in a math competition photo, standing right in the front row with a paper medal pinned to her chest. In a different picture, she stood on the school playground next to a smaller boy, her hand on his shoulder as if to protect him. The caption read, "Amelia Reyes was praised by her teacher for helping a new student feel welcome." Ronan stared at that photo for a very long time. His daughter was protecting someone vulnerable, the exact opposite of what he had done 6 years ago. But the one detail that sent a true chill down his spine was from a small post on the Pilsen Community Center website. They had held a career day, asking each child what they wanted to be when they grew up. Beside the name Amelia Reyes, age 5, her answer was written out exactly. "I want to build a house nobody can break." Ronan read the words over and over. Marchetti Holdings, The empire his grandfather started, and he now controlled, was founded on construction and real estate, on building things from concrete and steel. And a little girl who never knew her father, who had never stepped inside a Marchetti building, wanted to build houses. It seemed blood did not need a birth certificate to prove itself. It always found a way. The results came on a Thursday morning in a secure email to both of them. Ronan opened the file in his office. It was one page of cold, scientific terms and numbers, but the final line said it all. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. He already knew it was true. Her gray-green eyes had told him everything the first day he saw her. But knowing something and seeing it in black and white are two different things. The words on the page made his suspicion a reality he now had to face. The paper shook in his hand, not from shock, but from the immense weight of 6 years of absence, now officially his burden to carry. After the results were in, Ronan called Camille and asked to meet Amelia. Camille immediately laid out her rules. It had to be a public place, with no bodyguards, and no one else could know. She would introduce him only as her mother's friend. Ronan agreed to every condition. He understood he was in no position to make any demands. They decided on Millennium Park on a Saturday afternoon. Ronan showed up 30 minutes early. He parked a few blocks away and walked, wearing a simple black shirt and dark pants instead of a suit. He had even taken off his expensive watch and left it in the car. For the first time in years, he went somewhere completely alone, without a single guard. He sat on a stone bench near the Cloudgate sculpture, watching children run around the giant steel bean. He heard their laughter echo in the Chicago air and realized he had not sat in a public place like this, among normal people, in a very long time. He was not scanning the crowd for threats or watching for rivals. He was only thinking about a 5-year-old girl who was on her way, and he had no idea what to say to her. He had faced down a federal judge without flinching. He had stared down a rival mob boss without blinking. Yet the thought of talking to his own daughter made his palms sweat, and then he saw them. He saw. Camille was walking from Michigan Avenue, holding the hand of a little girl in a red coat, her black hair pulled back into a bouncy ponytail. Amelia looked all around the park with wide, curious gray-green eyes, as if the entire world was fascinating. Ronan stood up as they approached, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. Camille stopped and said in a calm voice, "Amelia, this is Ronan. He is a friend of your mom." Amelia looked up at him, tilting her head way back because he was so tall. Her gray-green eyes met his, and Ronan felt something shift deep inside him, in a place he thought had been locked up forever. "Hello, sir," Amelia said, her voice clear and bright. She was not scared or shy, just polite, the way a well-raised child speaks to an adult. "Hi, Amelia," Ronan replied, trying to keep his voice from shaking as his throat grew tight. The three of them sat on the bench. Camille sat between them at first, but Amelia soon moved next to Ronan to ask him about the giant steel bean. Ronan explained it was called Cloudgate. She nodded, then started telling him about her school, her best friend Lucia, and about the painting she did in art class of a tall building with many windows. Ronan listened to her, really listened. He was not waiting for his turn to speak. He was hanging on every word because each one felt precious. "What do you do?" Amelia asked him suddenly. "I build houses," Ronan said, simplifying his entire Marchetti Holdings empire into 3 words a 5-year-old could grasp. "Big houses or small ones?" she asked. "Both." Amelia tilted her head, thinking. "I like the small houses more. They feel warmer inside." Camille had to look away so no one would see the tears in her eyes. Amelia's words were innocent, but they pierced through all the layers of Ronan's wealth because his giant mansion on the Gold Coast had never once felt warm. Later, Camille bought Amelia an ice cream. The little girl picked chocolate, and after 2 licks, she had a brown smudge on the tip of her nose. Amelia tried to look at it by crossing her eyes, then let out a happy, bright laugh that filled the air. Ronan watched her and found himself laughing too. It was not his usual social smile, or the cold smile he used for business. This was a real smile that started deep in his eyes, the kind of smile he had not felt in years. Camille saw it, and she felt a small, quiet shift inside her, like a locked door creaking open just a tiny bit, and she did not know if she should push it open or slam it shut. Less than a week after that meeting, a ghost from the past came back. Gianni Marchetti had not simply vanished as Ronan had hoped. After being thrown out of the family, with all his money and protection gone, Gianni ended up on the south side. Drowning in old debts and growing bitterness, he contacted the Vulov syndicate. This was the same Eastern European mob he owed money to. He offered them a deal: inside information on the Marchetti family in exchange for cash and safety. Gianni knew the security layout of the Gold Coast mansion, Ronan's daily schedule, the names of his guards, and the weak points in the company's finances. He was ready to sell every secret he had. But the most dangerous information Gianni possessed was not on paper. In the weeks after he was exiled, Gianni still had one old contact on the security team who would text him occasionally. From those small messages, Gianni learned that Ronan had started going somewhere alone on Saturdays without any bodyguards, which was unheard of. Gianni followed him one day out of pure curiosity and saw Ronan in Millennium Park with a woman and a little girl. A little girl who had the exact same gray-green eyes as Ronan. Gianni did not need a DNA test to know exactly what he was seeing. The phone call came to Ronan at 11 o'clock on a weeknight. Ronan knew it was his brother's voice right away. "I thought you told me I was not a Marchetti anymore," Gianni said, his voice dripping with bitterness and victory. "But it looks like you have a secret you do not want anyone to know about. A little daughter in Pilsen, with eyes just like yours. It's like, it would be a real shame if word got out that she exists. Would not it, brother?" Ronan was silent for 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, felt like an eternity. In those 3 seconds, he saw that Amelia was not just his daughter. She had now become a liability. This was precisely the outcome Camille had dreaded 6 years ago, the very reason she had kept her child a secret from him. Now, that fear was a reality. He ended the call and immediately contacted his security chief, ordering 2 agents to watch the apartment building in Pilsen around the clock. Later that night, he drove there himself. He parked his car in front of the old red brick building where Camille lived and walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor for the very first time. He noted the cracked concrete, the unsteady iron railing, and the flickering hallway light over peeling paint. A wave of deep shame washed over him. His daughter had spent 5 years growing up here, while he lived in a mansion with bulletproof windows and heated floors. Camille answered after his 3rd knock. She wore an old nightgown, her hair was down, and her eyes were sharp and cautious. The moment she saw Ronan, she knew something was terribly wrong. He was not the type of man to make a surprise visit at midnight. Ronan wasted no time and told her about Gianni's call, and about the news about Amelia being discovered did not scare Camille. It made her furious. 6 years of contained anger finally broke through in a sharp, quiet voice. "This is the very reason I did not want you to know. This is the world I worked to keep my daughter away from. Now you have brought it to my front door." Ronan stood silently and accepted her words because she was right. Everything she said was true, and he had no defense. "I know," he admitted. "But your anger does not matter right now. Amelia needs to be safe. Let me provide that. Not because I have earned it, but because she deserves it." Camille saw him standing there, in the shabby hallway of a building he would never normally enter. She knew that even if she slammed the door on him, the danger would not just disappear. "Amelia can never know," she stated, her tone shifting from rage to resolve. "On the surface, her life will not change. No bodyguards at school, no special cars, nothing to make her afraid. If you want to protect her, do it so she never even knows she is being protected." Ronan agreed, then drove back to the Gold Coast to handle Gianni in the way his world handles threats. Yelena tracked the Volkov syndicate's money to Gianni and stopped it. She did this by telling Vulov that Gianni had lied about the information's value to get more money. This changed Gianni from a source to a fraud in the eyes of his protectors. At the same time, Ronan delivered a firm message to the Vulov syndicate through a secure channel. Any action against the Marchetti family would be seen as a declaration of war, and a war with them was something no Chicago group could win. Vulov got the message. Gianni lost his protection, his money, and all his advantages. 2 weeks later, he got on a westbound night bus and vanished from the city, just as Camille had left the Gold Coast 6 years before. But Camille had left with her pride, while Gianni left with nothing but a worthless name. After the Gianni problem was solved, the Saturday meetings at Millennium Park started again. Ronan always came early. He wore no suit and had no bodyguards close by. But now, 2 of his men watched from a distance, men Amelia would never see. She began to see Ronan's presence as a normal part of her weekend. She would show him her good math grades, talk about a new drawing from school, and ask him about everything. She wondered why big buildings do not fall and why Chicago's sky was often so gray. Ronan answered all her questions with a patience he did not know he had. His own world did not encourage patience. As months went by, Camille watched from a distance, never getting involved but always paying attention. She noticed Amelia started to look forward to seeing Ronan more. She saw how her daughter would run to him at their usual bench. She began hearing stories at home that started with, "Uncle Ronan said." Camille realized the secret could not be kept for much longer. Amelia had a right to know the truth. Every day she waited was another day her daughter was living a lie. Camille picked a peaceful Sunday afternoon. She asked Ronan to come to their apartment in Pilsen. It was the second time he had walked up those red brick steps, but this time it was not about a danger, but about peace. Amelia was drawing in her notebook on the old couch when Ronan arrived. She looked up and smiled. "Uncle Ronan," she said before returning to her drawing. Camille sat next to her. Ronan sat in the chair facing them. The living room was so tight that the 3 of them were nearly touching. The ceiling fan spun slowly above. The late afternoon sun came through the window, lighting up the old wooden floor. Camille put a hand on Amelia's knee to get her to stop drawing and pay attention. "Amelia, your mom has something very important to tell you." Amelia put her pencil down and looked at her mother, then to Ronan, and then back. Her gray-green eyes looked much older than her years. "Ronan is not just my friend," Camille explained, her voice steady, though she squeezed Amelia's knee to stop it from shaking. "He is your father." There was a silence. It was not a dramatic pause from a movie, but the quiet of a 5-year-old trying to understand something huge. But her instincts understood more than most adults would guess. Amelia did not cry. She did not scream. She did not have a big reaction. She just looked at Ronan for a very long time with eyes that were exactly like his. Then she asked in a small, steady voice, "Why was Dad not here before?" The question was simple, but it held the weight of 5 Father's Days without a card to make. 5 years of hearing friends talk about their dads while she did not have one. 5 years of seeing the empty space on her birth certificate and never asking her mother about it. Ronan did not make up excuses or give a long story. He did not blame anyone else. "Because I was wrong," he said quietly, keeping his eyes on his daughter. "And it took me a very long time to figure that out." Amelia tilted her head, thinking deeply like she always did. Then she asked another question. "Do you figure it out now?" "I do," Ronan said, one word, and that was all he needed to say. The 5-year-old before him did not need complicated answers. She just needed to know that her father was here now, and that he finally understood. Amelia put her notebook down, got off the sofa, walked the 2 short steps to Ronan, and gave him a hug. It was a quick, gentle hug, with 2 small arms wrapping around the neck of the man she had called uncle just months before. But that single hug was strong enough to erase 6 years of separation in a way words never could. Ronan hugged his daughter back, carefully and softly, as if holding the most valuable thing in the world. Because he was. He was not a man who hugged people often. His life had no space for that kind of softness. But as his daughter's arms gently held his neck, an instinct stronger than any defense showed him how to rest a hand on her back and just be still. Camille watched them from the sofa. When Amelia put her head on Ronan's shoulder, Camille looked out the window. Tears ran down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of relief. She had carried this secret by herself for 6 long years. And now the weight was not just on her anymore. Her daughter finally knew who her father was. And the little girl did not cry. She hugged. Sometimes, the forgiveness of a 5-year-old is more direct and powerful than any court decision. In the weeks that followed that Sunday, the word dad started to appear in Amelia's vocabulary, like a tiny animal, learning to stand. The first time she said it was at the park, so softly it was almost a whisper. Dad, look what I drew. Then she glanced up at Ronan, as if to make sure the word was okay to use. Ronan nodded, his eyes getting a little misty, but he quickly looked away. The next week, she said it a bit louder. Dad, Lucia likes to draw houses just like me. A week later, the word came out as easily as a breath. Dad, I am hungry. And Ronan knew it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in his 37 years. The family was built one brick at a time. Ronan slowly became part of Amelia's everyday life, not with money or influence, but simply by being there. When Erasco Academy sent an invitation for the parent meeting at the start of the year, Camille asked Ronan if he would like to attend. He went and sat on a small blue plastic chair in the kindergarten room. His knees were nearly at his chest because the chairs were for parents sitting next to their kids. He was surrounded by regular fathers in t-shirts and jeans. Ronan Marchetti was so out of place that it was almost comical. He was taller than most men there, with his back perfectly straight from years of leading meetings. Even in simple clothes, his Italian leather jacket was worth more than what the 3 fathers next to him were wearing combined. But when the teacher asked Amelia to introduce a family member, she stood up, pointed to Ronan, and said, "This is my dad." Her voice was completely normal and full of pride, and in that moment, Ronan did not feel out of place at all. He was just a dad on a tiny plastic chair, and that was the only title that was important in that room. A few weeks after that, Amelia came home with a picture from art class. She put it on the kitchen table in their Pilsen apartment for Camille to see. The drawing showed a house with large windows and a red roof. In front of the house stood 3 people. The tallest was on the left, the middle-sized one was in the center, and the smallest was on the right. Above them, in the shaky handwriting of a 5-year-old, Amelia had written, "Mom, Dad, and me." Camille looked at it for a long while. She did not cry, as she had already shed all her tears. Instead, she felt a gentle warmth fill her entire chest. A hospital visit. He offered a kindness she had forgotten existed after 6 years on her own. Camille put the drawing on her refrigerator, where it remained for years to come. Eventually, the day came for Amelia's first weekend at the mansion. After long talks with Ronan, Camille agreed, with strict ground rules. Ronan had prepared a special room for his daughter. It was not extravagant, but it was warm and inviting, with books, art supplies, and a window overlooking the garden. Amelia entered the huge house with wide-eyed wonder. She explored everything, then stopped and said, "Your house is really big, but it's also a little sad, Dad." Ronan paused. "Why do you think it is sad?" Amelia replied, "Because nobody ever laughs here." Her simple, honest words struck him harder than any business report. He knew she was right. His home was completely without joy. Him was teaching him what his father never could. This house had never known the sound of laughter. In his father's day, and in his own, it was a place of orders, of silence broken only by footsteps on wood. That evening, a father and daughter were watching a cartoon in the vast living room. Amelia was curled on the couch next to Ronan, her feet warm in the cat-themed socks Camille had found at a second-hand shop. Halfway through the movie, Amelia looked up, her voice sleepy but sincere, and asked, "Dad, do you have regrets?" Ronan gazed down at his little girl. Did he ever? Regret what exactly? That he failed to listen to her mom when she needed him most. Amelia considered this, her gray-green eyes blinking slowly. "Well, that is okay now," she said, "because you listened to us." She turned back to the screen as if she had solved a simple puzzle. For Ronan, it was anything but simple. It was absolution. Not the kind adults trade, but the pure, unguarded forgiveness from a child who lives in the now. And for the first time, sitting in his own home, he heard laughter fill the mansion as Amelia giggled at the screen. He realized the 5-year-old beside, she gave him something no one in his world ever had, a real reason to become a better man. Gossip among Chicago's elite spreads like wildfire. Their circles are small, their mouths even bigger. The story about Ronan Marchetti's secret daughter with a former maid was the talk of the town. At a Friday charity gala at the Peninsula Hotel, amidst powerful men with practiced smiles, a competitor named Harrison Burke spoke loudly enough for Ronan to hear. "Heard Marchetti's playing house with the help and her kid in Pilsen. Must be his new pet project." A few men laughed quietly. Ronan set his glass down, turned, and stood before Harrison Burke. He kept his voice low, a sign everyone present recognized as true danger. "A quiet Ronan Marchetti was the most dangerous one. The woman you speak of," he said softly, "built a company herself while you enjoyed your inheritance. She is my daughter's mother. Do not mention her again." Harrison Burke went pale. The room was silent. They recognized a Marchetti warning. It would not be given twice. Later, driving home, Ronan thought about it. He had publicly defended Camille and acknowledged Amelia to the city's elite. He felt no remorse. But in her apartment, Camille was dealing with a different kind of dread. Amelia, home from her weekend away, described her big room at her dad's, the huge garden, and a bathtub as large as their entire bedroom. Camille smiled, but inside, she felt a knot form in her stomach. Ronan's world was grand and dazzling. Camille worried her little 2-bedroom apartment, decorated with magazine butterflies, would soon seem drab to her daughter. But later, as she tucked Amelia in, the little girl cuddled with her worn teddy bear. In a drowsy voice, she whispered, "Mommy, our bed is cozier. Daddy's bed is big, but ours is cozier." Camille sat quietly for a second before kissing her daughter's brow. She realized love is not about the size of a house. Her daughter, at just 5 years old, already understood the difference between large and loving. 15 miles away, Ronan entered his study. The portrait of his grandfather, the founder of their violent empire, watched him with unchanging eyes. Ronan glanced from the portrait to his phone's background, a picture of Amelia grinning with ice cream on her nose, a photo from their day at Millennium Park. 2 images represented 2 different worlds. One was an empire built on fear. The other was a daughter who wanted a safe home. Ronan finally had a real reason to change. He did not want Amelia to know the dark truth about him. Quitting was not an option in his world. But he could shift toward legitimacy, separating his family from the dirty work. Then, the answer, "I build things," would be more truth than a lie. His relationship with Camille changed in small increments. He started calling her about every decision related to Amelia, from new shoes to her weekend stays, and she started to pick up the phone without her stomach twisting into knots. They were learning to communicate not as a boss and his former maid, but as co-parents. Neither of them ignored their history, but they both prioritized Amelia over their own egos, creating a foundation for something new. One rainy evening after a school meeting, Ronan offered Camille a ride home to Pilsen. She normally took the bus. After a moment's thought, she accepted. It was not about needing the ride. It was about being tired of proving her independence. The drive was mostly quiet, with only brief mentions of Amelia's schoolwork. As they pulled up to her apartment building, the downpour had softened to a drizzle. Camille reached for the door handle but stopped when Ronan spoke. "Thanks for not shutting me out," he said. She turned to face him. In the dim glow of the streetlights, his expression seemed different from the cold boss she remembered from 6 years prior. There was a hint of softness there now. "I did it for Amelia, not for you," she said honestly. "I know," he responded. Those two simple words, spoken quietly while holding her gaze, meant everything. Camille's look softened in return. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but the wall between them was lower. It was an unspoken understanding. Both of them felt it. No one moved closer. It was just a real moment between two people navigating what was broken and what could be fixed. Camille exited the car, offered a quick goodnight, and went inside. Ronan stayed, in the car, watching the building's door close. He did not leave immediately. He knew this thing between them was no fairy tale romance. It was slow, serious, and real, founded on confessed mistakes and newly earned respect. It was the only way for two people like them to cautiously come together. Months later, on a bright spring afternoon when Chicago's winter had finally broken, they all returned to Millennium Park. The bench was the same, the giant reflective bean was the same, and children's laughter still filled the air. But everything felt different. 6 years ago, Camille had left his home in the rain, penniless and pregnant. Now she walked beside that same man because she chose to look forward. Amelia ran on ahead, her dark hair catching the wind as her sneakers tapped on the path. Her laugh echoed off the surrounding skyscrapers. Ronan and Camille walked behind, not touching, but close enough for their shoulders to almost meet. Camille watched Amelia and spoke, her voice even but her words heavy with 6 years of history. "That day in your office was the worst day of my life," she said. "But it's also the day everything I have now truly began." Ronan was quiet for a few steps. "And it was the day I lost everything that mattered without even knowing it." No more words were needed. Their past was still there, but it was not a wall anymore. It was a broken foundation they could now build on. Amelia stopped by a reflecting pool, glanced back at them, and then ran toward them, her hair wild and free. Her eyes shining in the afternoon light, grabbed her mother's hand with her left, and her father's with her right. "Come on," she urged. "Last one there has to buy ice cream." She pulled them along faster, the three of them walking by the water. They were not a perfect family or a fairy tale romance. They were three people who had been wounded, made mistakes, and lost so much. But they chose to heal together instead of being trapped by the past. We often think losing control is the worst thing that can happen. But the real danger is not losing control. It is failing to listen. Not listening when someone is trying to tell you something important. Not listening when the truth is right in front of your face. Not listening when your pride is screaming louder than your heart. Camille had lost her job, but she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Ronan lost 6 years, but he learned to be a father, a lesson no amount of power or money could teach. And Amelia learned that love is not about mansions or fancy cars. It is about being present, being patient, and spending a Saturday afternoon on a park bench, getting your questions answered with the truth. Our mistakes do not have to define us, not if we find the courage to own them and to change. Responsibility is not something you can buy. It is something you build with your actions, day after day. Second chances are not given because we earn them. They are given because someone is brave enough to open a door they had every right to keep locked forever. For everyone listening, please hold on to this. Never make a choice until you have listened. Do not let your pride make decisions for you. Do not judge a person by their situation, because you have no idea what they have overcome just to be standing where they are. Life will always give you back what you put into it, and love, no matter how long it has been buried, can always rebuild from the ruins if you give it the space to grow. If you were moved by this story, tell me how it made you feel. Which person did you relate to the most? Have you ever been silenced when you needed to be heard? Or were you the one who refused to listen, only to regret it later? Please share in the comments. Every one of your stories matters, and I truly want to hear them. If this story meant something to you, please press the like button and share this video with the people you care about. You never know who might need to hear this exact message at this exact moment. And if you are not already subscribed, please do so now and turn on all notifications so you never miss our daily stories. Here, every story has a lesson that might just change how you see the world. I want to wish everyone watching this video good health, a life full of joy, and daily peace. Thank you so much for being here with me all the way to the end. Goodbye for now, and I will see you in the next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.